administration in Washington. As I said, we've done this before. We've been to this. And
isn't necessarily the best place to start. In fact, I think our reverence for the truth might have become a bit of a distraction that is.
You condemn white supremacy. And he fumbled around, didn't say anything. I said, how about the Proud Boys? And he said, well,
Ronald Reagan was 2 months into his presidency when John Hinckley Jr. blew a $20 million. About blowing up the White House.
If you want to really see something that said, take a look what happened.
I want to take this message to talk to your viewers real quick about the story, the conversation we need to have now. The BOP is wasting lots of tax dollars in frivolous spending, and welcome to the American Rising. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And we got an exciting show, an episode for you today. Does it seem like the media apparatuses in America do nothing more these days than spew propaganda on the right and the left? Does it not seem like our media, no matter whether it's Fox News or CNN, just appear to be two heads of the same seven-headed dragon? Maybe they are. There was once a time where journalism was a very pure and organic industry, where men and women reported the facts and only the facts, their opinions, their perception, their ideals and values were not part of the equation when bringing you the news. And one can make the argument that that ship has sailed a long time ago, and you could be right. But there are journalists out there that are dedicated to journalism, that believe in the root value of this industry and this profession and still practice it. Most of these journalists I have found have been doing this for a really, really long time. And that is true with our guest today, Dan Luzadder. Dan Luzadder is a author and Pulitzer Prize winner, 50 years in journalism, and author of the book, The Manchurian Journalist, a book that I personally have read and I really enjoyed. And I have the author today to discuss his life work, who he is as a journalist, and the inspiration for writing this book about Lawrence Wright, the CIA, and the corruption of American journalism. I think just in that title alone, no matter what side of the illusion of an aisle that you are on, you could agree with that. And Dan, I find to be a very credible person who takes journalism serious. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Luzzader. How are you? Luzadder. Sorry, I said it wrong again, even though I asked you before how to properly pronounce it. And I am a community college dropout, as you have just noticed.
Well, college doesn't teach you everything in the world. Thanks, Barry, for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation about journalism. I think it's important, particularly now, and has always been important in the history of this country, how journalism has served its role or not served its role, in the American process.
And you, sir, have been doing this for a very long time. You are an investigative journalist now for over 50 years. You're still active in this profession. And you started off, correct me if I'm wrong, investigating very high profile cold cases and other things like that. And is that how you started your career?
Well, I didn't really start my career at that level. I started it basically on the street. I was a teenage police reporter working for a very gritty morning daily, and where things were done the old-fashioned way, the way they'd been done for 50 years before I came along, certainly. And I got a real schooling in the way that journalism can work in a community and what makes journalism interesting, really. You know, starting out on police beat, and I was a pretty sheltered evangelical kid when I went to work for a newspaper, and suddenly finding life out on the street in the ways that it really is, and seeing what police do and how they work with the community, seeing the stories of common people, I was very attracted to that. And as a result, I wound up becoming a columnist, and I worked for a couple of different newspapers as a columnist, and then shared the Pulitzer not for investigative reporting, but for general local reporting, because I took I made a habit of trying to do things a little differently than a lot of reporters did. So I spent time, getting to know people who were not commonly covered. And that led me to finding out things from the street. And I became an investigative reporter, realizing that I could have more impact on things that needed to be addressed, things that were problematic, than I could as a columnist expressing an opinion or just highlighting certain events within a community. And as I think you might find interesting, one of the first stops along that route was investigating corruption and prison conditions at that time in the Indiana state prison system, and then later on in the federal prison system. And I spent many years and devoted a lot of effort to coming to know people who knew things and could tell me about things the way things really were. And that led me to some pretty high profile investigative work, which included Columbine. I've done national stories on political and corruption, political corruption, and police corruption, those sorts of things. So it's been a long and interesting career.
Yeah, I would say so. And you, at some point in your career, you start to take a notice of the inner workings of journalism, the webs weave behind the scenes and how things work, so to say. At what point does your work in journalism bring you to this character, Lawrence Wright? Do you have an introduction to that? What point do you start to notice the things that bring you to investigate Lawrence Wright?
Well, that's a long and winding road. When I was a young journalist, I went to college. It took me 10 years to get through school. And by that time, I was a professional reporter by the time I ended. And so I gradually got to know, how newsrooms work. As I write about in the Manchurian Journalist, I saw old hands teaching young hands how to find sources, how to build networks of information, how to be something more than a person who calls people up on the phone and asks them what they think, to actually dig into things. But that process was a long one and a pretty slow learning curve, I would guess. Over a period of years, I was fairly successful. But getting to Lawrence Wright really was a result of a philosophy I think I have in journalism, which is to listen to people's stories, to not be skeptical at the outset, or to have an ideological bias that tells me who I can talk to or who I can't talk to. And so in the process of all this over a period of years, and I began to freelance after I left daily newspapers. I worked for the New York Daily News and New York Times, freelancing stories for them and for magazines, various magazines. But at some point in time, I came to meet some people from the Church of Scientology. And they were interested in having a journalist with some experience look into the coverage of the church and how it had unfolded and how fair it had been. And most journalists would not, I think, engage with a controversial organization like the Church of Scientology unless they had an open mind to hear what people had to say. So in the course of that, I discovered that Lawrence Wright had written a book about the church, and I I took on examining that book for the accuracy and factualness of the book. And there were some significant problems. All journalists and all writers, make mistakes. Whatever. His seemed a little more purposeful than they did accidental, and to create a point of view. And I got to wondering about Lawrence Wright himself. And that launched me onto the trail that ended in the Manchurian journalist, because what I found about Lawrence Wright was that his highly successful career as a journalist, and he, I should note, wrote the book Looming Tower, which examined the 9/11 issues, Osama bin Laden, the history, etc. And he won a Pulitzer for that book. He's been a writer for the New Yorker since the 90s, the early 90s. He had significant, I discovered, connections to the intelligence community that he had never disclosed. And I also looked into a memoir that he wrote, and I discovered that there were several issues there about the plausibility and factualness of the memoir. And then I discovered that his association with the American University in Cairo was very similar to a path that the CIA and related intelligence organizations created for people that they wanted to be friends, associates, and helpmates in developing our interests elsewhere in the world. So that's how I got to Lawrence Wright, after a very long career in doing this sort of work.
And so, that's what took me by surprise when I started reading your book. I didn't expect it to start out with Scientology, and I didn't know much about Scientology other than what I read in the news or what I seen in TV. And it wasn't a very positive aspect. And I couldn't for the life of me think of, well, who formulated this opinion? I had a negative opinion about Scientology, yet I knew nothing about it. And I thought, well, wait a minute, where is this similar in my life? Well, I know what it's like to be labeled something that I'm not and have a narrative spun around. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe I should consider the fact I'm not the only one that the media has done, or I'm not the only person, or so I started to begin to read the book. And the more I read it, I realized, well, my opinion about Scientology wasn't formed from any factual basis that I researched. It was formulated from news articles that I read, basically.
Right.
And so who is Lawrence Wright, and why is he significant to the understanding of Scientology, and why did you start to look at him in particular through this endeavor in Scientology?
Well, he wrote the book Going Clear about the church, and it was billed in all the media and all the coverage, got wonderful coverage and wonderful reviews. It was billed as the definitive word about Scientology, and it painted a very negative picture. It implied a lot of things. And not only did he write the book, but he participated in a documentary that followed up, Going Clear, which was done by Alex Gibney, the famed documentary filmmaker. Interestingly enough, as I got down the road, I discovered that Alex Gibney had some of the same connections and associations that Lawrence Wright did with the intelligence community, again, never disclosed to the public. But the idea of the picture that was created of Scientology, because what they asked me was, is this fair reporting? In your opinion, as a journalist, is this, complete? It launched me on an interesting experience, because I got very deeply into the Church of Scientology's history, its background. I met people and traveled the world literally, visiting churches, talking to members, talking to people who were opposed to Scientology, talking to people that claimed that they had been mistreated by Scientology. And what I found was something far different than what was painted by the media. It's far different than these popular stories that are done. The media has changed a lot. There was coverage of the Church of Scientology in the 1970s and the 1980s. What most people don't know is that the Church of Scientology itself sponsored investigative reporting and was one of the leaders in developing the Freedom of Information Act. They were very effective. The people that I met inside, all the way from David Miscavige down as chairman of the Board of Religious Technology and titular head of the Church of Scientology, all the way down to people who worked in cafeterias, who provided transportation back and forth for members and here and elsewhere. I found a dedication to a system of beliefs that very unlike what is described popularly in the public press, and motivated by some fairly good values, I thought, in my opinion. So my assessment of the church, and I did have some conflicts with them in the course of writing the book. There were parts they weren't happy with. I think every story I've ever written has had parts people weren't happy with, some more than others. But I found them to be fair. I found them to be open, anxious to really tell their story. I told them when I said I'll do this. If I have a question, you got to answer it, and you got to show me the documents. And there were times when people would bring boxes of files into rooms to explain to me what the history was, especially the church's fight with the federal government, particularly the IRS, and their battles with others over things that they believe deeply in, like the abuse of the pharmaceutical industry of individuals, something that they were pretty effective in addressing at one point in a very costly way for them, I'm afraid. But having the attitude to go into places, to really listen to people's stories, to not assume that what you read in the paper is necessarily correct, or not to assume that it's necessarily incorrect, I think are important things to really understanding what's going on out here in the world.
Sure. And it seems like, I think that we the people, as well as the industry of journalism, have all lost their way, because just a minute ago, as I expressed, I knew nothing about Scientology other than what I was told, and yet I was willing to believe my unfounded negative opinion just based on things that I read or didn't read. But Lawrence Wright now, and the CIA, now you discovered, not only did you discover he had connections to the intelligence community, you discovered that he blatantly, deliberately didn't disclose this information. So what did that look like?
Well, one of the most fascinating things I found as I began to research his memoir and began to look around the people around him, his memoir talked about conflicts with his father. His father was a military man. It was fairly high up in rank and in the National Guard at one point. He served honorably in the military, and a Bronze Star. He was in different theaters, both in Korea and in Europe. And Lawrence Wright characterized himself as a young man who disagreed with the military perspective, and he and his father got into a lot of fights and whatever about that. And so he had characterized this picture and his father as a small town banker who was very civically involved, etc. So as I do with most any investigative project, I begin to pull apart little things and little parts of little stories to see what I can understand about the areas surrounding individuals. So as I looked at this little storefront bank that his father ran as president, I discovered that it had been founded by a man named Robert G. Story, and I wanted to know who he was. And so I began to look into him, and much to my astonishment, I found that he was the chief executive trial prosecutor in the Nuremberg war trials. I thought, that's pretty amazing. Here's this close association, yet Lawrence Wright in his memoir or anywhere else had never mentioned this very significant historical figure, Robert Story. As I continued to press down the road on who Robert Story was, I discovered he was chairman of the Board of Foreign Scholarships for the U.S. State Department. He was head of the American Bar Association. He had a close association with a man named John McCloy, who was later described by the New York Times as the chairman of the establishment, one of the people that was very influential in establishing our current intelligence networks. Robert Story was extremely involved in those intelligence networks. He worked closely with a man named Carl Habelsel. They created a foundation. Carl Habelsel was head of Republic National Bank, it turned out, in Dallas, and Story was on the board there. Story was the dean of the Southern Methodist University Law School. I began to find links where they were bringing people for scholarships into SMU and into other places who had interesting political connections in places like Nicaragua and Panama and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then as I began to follow Wright's story about how he happened to become involved with a small publishing course, a summer course at Radcliffe College. He attended this summer course waiting to find out if he would be approved as a conscientious objector in the Vietnam War. And it turned out that this course was a recruiting tool to develop intelligence connections inside the publishing industry, inside the magazine industry, inside newspapers, etc., run by a fascinating woman named Helen Venn, who was very influential in developing American cultural ideology in foreign countries all over the world when she wasn't doing her little summer course. She wound up as a reference for Wright's surprising acceptance by the American University in Cairo for a graduate fellowship sponsored by the Ford Foundation. She was a reference for him there, and the book tells a rather fantastic story of how he managed to suddenly get to American University in Cairo, which clearly was an outpost for the Central Intelligence Agency in developing Middle East contacts.
So that I wanted to touch on that. I think you brilliantly brought it right to that point. The American University in Cairo. I had heard about it previously prior to reading your book, but I didn't understand the full depth of what has been going on there for quite some time. And you bring it up and you give a little historical notation about it. What can you tell people about the American University in Cairo and what you believe goes on at that establishment?
Well, my familiarity is more what has happened in the past than what's currently going on or what sort of changes might exist now, because my focus was on Wright's tenure when he was there. One thing that I did find was that there were a lot of conscientious objectors who wound up at the American University in Cairo. And many of them had interesting connections to foundations. Some of those went on to form foundations themselves. And these foundations, all the way from Carl Habelsel's foundation in Dallas, which supported the Cultural Cold War, the American political propaganda machine, to the tune of some $500 million. These foundations had links back to the American University in Cairo, but its history was one of a religious foundation, and then gradually over time, its association with individuals who are connected to the intelligence community seemed to have an influence over what it was and what it did. At the time that Lawrence Wright went to do his graduate study at AUC, there was no travel to Egypt. There was no American embassy. There was a war going on between Israel and Egypt. Just to be able to maneuver all that to get in and out of the city was a tenuous process into Cairo. But the American University, I found, became the de facto American embassy in Cairo when everything else was shut down because there were no diplomatic relations during the period of war. And so as I looked deeper into the university, I saw that there were tremendous support by the Ford Foundation, one of a very, very prominent role in developing university programs, particularly the American University of Cairo Press, which was producing books out of the Middle East that were promoting pro-Western values, and they were getting into the hands of people in various countries. They were developing links with those people. A lot of it had to do with the oil industry. And of course, Robert Story and Republic National Bank and the Texas oil men were very interested in what was going on in the Middle East and what kind of intelligence they could develop. And they were very adept at using academic environments to do so. I mean, when you look back in history and you realize that the sociology department of the University of Michigan was basically running the Vietnam government, during the Vietnam War, and you see that that various cultural aspects within our society were tapped by intelligence interests, not prominently or publicly, but in a clandestine way, like the student organizations during the 60s. The CIA was basically running their operations, or they were getting people who were on the inside to assist with their operations. Gloria Steinem was used as a propaganda tool in Europe for youth festivals in the 60s, and she was brought to prominence by Frank Gibney, who was a prominent journalist and the person and the father of Alex Gibney, the documentary filmmaker. And Frank Gibney wrote books for the CIA under different nom de plumes, and he wrote a book called the Penkovsky Papers, supposedly the diary of a double agent that worked for the United States and was part of the Soviet military. That turned out to be a pretty much wholly concocted piece of work, though very influential in American attitudes. So all of these tentacles, all of these things that you see when you dig deeply enough and find the records, and this little book has a lot of footnotes in it. When you see these tentacles, you begin to understand that there's more to the intelligence community than the CIA and CIA agents conducting their outside activities beyond the domestic borders. You see that there are intelligence networks within the country. And it turned out that Lawrence Wright's father's little bank, and I interviewed former directors and former vice presidents, it was staffed with too many loan officers, and almost all of them had military background, and almost all of them were doing something else. And the man who was the senior resident agent for the FBI during the Kennedy assassination ended up going to work with Lakewood Bank and Trust. It was essentially non-official cover for some agency operations. Again, something Lawrence Wright's never addressed.
Yeah, and you find that kind of consistent throughout a lot of things that Lawrence Wright publishes and talks about through his career. There's always, it seems to be, some kind of angle. And that brings me to the question of, where did Lawrence Wright begin his journalism career in journalism?
Well, he first went to work for a little magazine called Race Relations Reporter. And it was kind of a fascinating publication. It started out tracking segregation and desegregation. And one of the main things that Race Relations Reporter developed with a very small staff was a library. And they clipped every newspaper in the country. They clipped foreign newspapers as well on issues of race relations. And they became really a font of information about the status of things, a lot of research. But they also published a little magazine that gradually strayed from the focus of just segregation and integration into other issues of race relations. And about the time they did that, Lawrence Wright managed to get a job at Race Relations Reporter. It's interesting to note that most of the funding for Race Relations Reporter came from the Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation was very active in the intelligence community and intelligence networks in the country and elsewhere, a big funder of various programs and operations. But the Race Relations Reporter magazine was one of those they funded. I tracked down a former managing editor at Race Relations Reporter who hired Wright, and he had some not too flattering things to say about Wright's attitude and his work, and he was actually fired from that magazine for racism, something the acknowledges. But the magazine itself was an interesting launch point because it seemed to me as if it was a way to move Lawrence Wright perhaps through the network as a common reporter and but up into other opportunities. So he went from there to an affiliate of Race Relations Reporter, part of a school news operation on the East Coast. And then he did a story for Look magazine about astronauts, which got some attention. And then he wound up working for Texas Monthly, which was became a very prominent culturally hip magazine run by Michael Levy and William Broyles, its first editor. And Broyles also had connections to Helen Venn from Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course. In fact, she helped Broyles and Michael Levy found a duplicate sort of organization at Rice University. Broyles went on to become beyond first editor of Texas Monthly. He became a writer and screenwriter and became quite famous in his work. He wrote the script for Castaway with Tom Hanks and a number of other films. He has been involved in filmmaking and other ventures. Another person who was involved in that Rice University Publishing Procedures course, a recruiting tool for the agencies and the intelligence network, was Daniel Okrent, who was the first public editor for the New York Times. As I began to look at publishing and these various aspects of how they were developing friends, the intelligence community was developing friends in the media, I began to understand that, you don't have to have everybody in the room. But if you've got people who are working in publishing, who are selecting who is getting published and who isn't, because we know that the major publishers can, make an author's career or not. You have those kinds of influences, and you track back and you see that major publishers like Cass Canfield was on the board of a foundation that was a CIA front. We began to see how these networks work of working to infiltrate media at all levels, not just magazines, newspapers, and television media, but also the entertainment media. And so there you have interests in Hollywood making decisions about how they portray certain things in history, how things are recorded, and it's I think those influences are out there purposefully, and while they may not be visible, they're very important in understanding that our perceptions of things can be clouded, influenced, and as you say, we can be brought to believe things that are not necessarily true.
Yeah. If there was one way to really be successful in doing that, it would be mass media. I mean, the things we consume and we read shape our opinions about the way we see the world, for better or for worse. Now your work into learning about Lawrence, you attempt to reach out to him, and I think you make contact with this guy.
Oh yeah, several times.
He gets to know you a little bit.
He does.
Talk to me about your experience with that and the kind of rigmarole you were taking on trying to establish contact with Mr. Wright.
He seems like a very affable man, and obviously he's intelligent and a pretty good writer. I think somebody certainly I would have read, although I hadn't really paid much attention to him beforehand. But my style of investigative work is to get up close and personal when possible. And I went out to New York when Lawrence Wright was promoting his book and promoting the film, and attended one of the sessions that he had, um, and afterwards introduced myself to him and told him what I was doing and exactly what I was doing, and he said he would consider talking to me, but he had to review some things first. Later on, the excuse was he couldn't talk to me without HBO's permission, and there were some other reasons. But before I formally introduced myself, I think he already knew that I was tracking around a bit, and I flew down to Dallas and went to. He has a little band called the Hoodoo, and they were playing in a little bar, and I went in and sat and listened. And I also, the other members of the book or the band are also journalists, so I bought books of all of those members of the band who had also published, and I took them up and got signatures, and lastly got Lawrence Wright's signature. And when I went up and gave him the book and asked him to sign it, he asked me who to make it out to, and I told him my name, and he looked up and he recognized then who I was, and so he graciously signed the book, and he signed it, "You Know the Story." And I thought that was interesting because I would really come to know the story in much more depth than other people would probably pursue it. But later on, when Wright was on the Joe Rogan show, he characterized this visit as by a private investigator who was working for the Church of Scientology to stalk him. And he went on X and he said that I wasn't a journalist, that I was really a private investigator and hired by the church to create mischief. Well, he knew well who I was and knew my history. I've been at this a long time. I've covered a lot of different things, and successfully. I shared a Pulitzer Prize. I'm sure he was aware of all those things, but he carried on a little bit of propaganda himself by trying to mischaracterize who and what I was. I didn't hold that against him, and we had another session in Austin when he was promoting the film among some locals, and I visited there. He was asked during the course of after the film if he was ever frightened of Scientologists because of their bad reputation, and he said, "Well, someone who works for them is sitting in the audience," and he pointed me out. And all the people turned around and stared at this person who must certainly have horns under their hat. And but I did get him to let me ask the last question of the night, and he did so. And the question had to do with why his principal source in the book later said publicly that he had completely distorted certain portions of what he had been told and certain facts in the case about the IRS. And he said, "What do you expect me to respond to every bad review?" Which brought a laugh from the audience. But outside afterwards, I confronted him to ask him what he was, why he did what he did, and also to tell him I wanted to ask him about these connections that existed with the intelligence community. And he demurred and declined, and I didn't talk to him after that. I wrote him letters. I told him exactly what I was going to publish. I asked for him to respond and to give his point of view, but he chose not to do so.
And so you start to dig into his intelligence connections, and where does that bring you? What exactly do you find about Mr. Wright?
Well, I find that in addition to the fact that he's distorted some stories in his memoir, in fact, the kind of distortions I think would cause some controversy, as we've seen in other situations with memoirs where the facts don't line up with what's actually true. But but as I pulled apart these pieces, I felt uneasy about what he was telling us about the war on terror and how he was characterizing the failures of 9/11. That they resulted from a lack of communication between the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI. And he seemed to take the part of the FBI as to who might be to blame for those sorts of things. But at the same time, he was creating some perspectives that I think came fairly directly out of the intelligence community, perspectives that were reflected in The Looming Tower, his book on 9/11 and Osama bin Laden. And I began to find factual errors in that book, and some of them were just basic journalistic tip-offs. You know, you can take a look at some journalism, and you can determine whether or not the writer is being straight up with you about quotes and things by certain little mistakes they make. And one of those mistakes is to quote people and you say, they said, because people don't speak simultaneously and quote. And what I believe is anything that's between quote marks is the actual words, or as close as you can humanly come to the actual words. Those things that you don't hear personally, you can't put in quotes unless you're able to document it by transcript or something else. But Lawrence Wright had used quotes in his book Looming Tower from individuals who didn't speak English. They were quotes in Pashtun. He didn't hear them directly himself. They were repeated to him, and they were then converted to English, yet he put them in quotes as if he had heard these directly. Those little things tip you off as to, how careful a journalist is in what they're presenting to you. The further I went, the more I found, and the more disturbing they were. So Lawrence Wright's book, for instance, on the Church of Scientology, getting great reviews. One of those reviews was by Charles McGrath, who was a former New Yorker writer and then head of the review section for the New York Times, review of books, as I recall, is right. When he did his story, a profile on Lawrence Wright in the book, he stayed at Lawrence Wright's house. His son is a personal friend of Lawrence Wright. He didn't mention those things, and I called McGrath and I talked to him about it and confronted him about these things as to what his perspective was and whether or not those things violated the New York Times ethics policies. He didn't agree with that, but nothing I published about that drew any attention from the New York Times or those sorts of issues. So
now you're learning about his involvement there. Now you do discover that he does attend the university in Cairo. He was a student there.
Right.
Now, what you get into your book about this woman, I believe her name was Helen.
Right, Helen Venn.
And what is her significance in all this?
She was the liaison for the U.S. State Department to something called the Franklin Books Program. And the Franklin Books Program was a major propaganda tool that was used to idealize Western values and to carry that message into foreign countries, and used as an intelligence tool, really. And so she was very involved in that. Plus, she was head of this Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course, the 6-week summer course that Wright attended, and hundreds of others have attended. She had tremendous connections to the publishing industry. She knew everybody and everyone. John Updike, she'd get a famous writer to come and talk to her class or bring her class to their home or whatever. John Updike, Kurt Vonnegut, a lengthy list. The editor of Rolling Stone, Jan Wenner, and some of his people were close to Helen Venn. She had these very incredible connections, very social connections, And then she had connections with small publishers around the world who were doing the good work of Western cultural propaganda on behalf of the American government. And she was liaison to them. So she played a very significant role in the recruiting of people into the publishing industry. And she had her little summer course, the 6-week summer course, had a 97% placement rate in the publishing industry or in journalism.
Yeah, I remember reading that part. It almost sounds a little familiar and paradoxical to the federal system having a 98.7% conviction rating. So,
yeah, they're good at what they do, aren't they?
Yeah, they sure are. And so where does this start to blossom into? You begin to realize that this Lawrence Wright individual is doing less than honest reporting when it comes to Scientology, and you try to establish contact with him. You start to realize that he's not very honest about his past, and you start to discover his father. He claims that he has these estranged relationships with his father, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. Now you find out his father is attached to this bank in Dallas, Texas. Why is all this a little strange and peculiar?
Well, it's strange and peculiar because it's different than the way Lawrence Wright characterized it as being. When I discovered that Robert Story was the owner of that bank and realized that it was more of a tool for providing jobs for people of similar ideological interests and intelligence interests, and when I realized that it was part of a much larger network of things. I truly wanted to know from Lawrence Wright why he had not ever talked about these issues. If he was truly the person he characterized himself as being, as this curious journalist and later as an investigative reporter, I would think that he would have found these relationships worthwhile to talk about. The fact that Wright's father was also a fiduciary in the Southwest Legal Foundation, responsible for overseeing what they were doing with funding, told me that he knew exactly how money was being spent out of this foundation for intelligence purposes. And so that puts his father in the middle of these kinds of clandestine operations. And if that is the case, what is Lawrence Wright's role then as a journalist? Who is he loyal to? How are his perspectives influenced? And I think it offers us all the opportunity to ask the good question, which is, are we getting a true story from someone who is a major writer, a Pulitzer winner, a staff writer for the New Yorker, and very influential in perspectives. So and I want to touch on this. Part of the discovery in this journey to the Manchurian journalist was recognition that the industry itself that I grew up with, and literally I grew up in newsrooms as a teenager. The industry that I grew up with had changed in fundamental ways over the course of my career. When I started, a good many newspapers were locally owned, and they were locally controlled, and their interest was local. But they developed expertise about telling people the news, because people got most of their international news and their national news from the newspaper. It was part of the daily regimen. People read. They also got intensive local news. The first daily newspaper I worked at was owned by a small chain, the Pulliam family. They also owned the Arizona Republic and the Indianapolis Star and several other newspapers in Indiana. They adhered to the old style of reporting and fact gathering and the really fundamental work of journalism, getting it done fast, and getting it right. They saved their opinions for the editorial page. But over time, as people realized, I guess, that newspapers were a great source of profit, 15, 16, 18% a year, they began to be scooped up by corporate interests like Knight Ridder, Gannett, these large corporate organizations who also had interests in television stations, et cetera. As they were doing this, and we saw this process over time, and new technology coming along, making things faster and even faster than they were, although they were pretty fast back in the day when we still had teletypes and manual typewriters and hot type. As they saw these opportunities, things began to change. When I started, it was just before the era of Watergate, and people were very interested in investigative reporting, and that places like the Indianapolis Star formed investigative teams, highly independent even of editors within the organization. They did get their copy edited, and they stood to the same standards through legal as others, but they had the independence to go after things. The Indianapolis Star, in particular, had an excellent investigative team, and I worked there for 7 years, and they won Pulitzers for uncovering police corruption and political corruption, and did good work. But over time, the interest in doing that under the corporate press became more highly specialized, and the support for newsroom staffs and for retaining older reporters who had come up through the traditions and taught younger people how to do things began to erode and become diminished. And so now we have lost lots and lots of newspapers, and we've also lost the mentorships and the methods in which reporters discover how to be truthful and accurate. And we've seen this transition where people are writing stories as clickbait. You don't find out what happened in the lead of the story anymore. You find out 5 or 6 paragraphs down online because they want you to keep reading because you're going to hit ads, right? So as these corporate interests developed, and as the media was controlled by fewer and fewer hands, and we see situations like the entertainment media then involved with CBS, we see this controversy about Paramount and the restrictions supposedly on 60 Minutes reporting. And no matter where you stand on whether or not the press has a liberal bias to start with, or whether it has a conservative bias, or whether those things are equal, those things are not really supposed to enter in. I never voted in a primary while I was working for daily newspapers, and I didn't know other reporters who did either, because it was part of the ethic to stay away from the politics. You needed to stay independent. I became a registered Democrat at some point, not so long ago, only so I could vote in a Democrat primary about some candidates I thought might have better sense than others. But truly had been an independent and kept politics away from everything I did as much as possible. That doesn't mean I didn't confront people in government, because I did. Especially over investigation of prisons. I was investigating sexual abuse of women at the Indiana Women's Prison, and uncovered many examples of it, and wrote in the column I was writing about that sexual abuse. And the governor of the state of Indiana, Bob Orr, called the editor of the paper, and he said, "What the hell is wrong with you? Publishing something like this in a good Republican newspaper?" And he said, "Well, this is my columnist, and we try to give him some independence." He said, "Well, I want that son of a bitch in my office this Friday at 3:00 in the afternoon." And so the editor told me, he said, "Well, the governor's calling you in for a command performance before he wants you in his office Friday." I said, "Okay, I'll go down and see him." So I went down to see him, and he got pretty upset about the coverage of this and the embarrassment to him through the Department of Correction and whatever else, and he demanded a retraction. And I said, no, I'm not retracting anything. In fact, I'm going to write more, and I'm going to keep writing until you clean it up.
Good.
And so he got really loud in his response, and the doors of the governor's office burst open, and 2 state troopers rushed in with their hands on their pistol
Wow.
hands. They thought
Wow.
the governor was at risk, but the only risk was in dealing with journalism that was factual and truthful. And we kept going, and that prison got sued, and they reorganized how they were handling female inmates.
Oh, it sounds like the governor there might have been trying to interfere with the First Amendment.
Well, there are often attempts to do that from all sides.
Oh, yeah. Well,
especially if it's your ox that's getting gored, I guess.
where do you see other Lawrence Wrights showing up in media today? Where do you see the most prominent displays of intelligence interference in our media apparatuses in our current time?
In our current time, it would be hard for me to describe specifically because I haven't researched that particular angle, but I think we can see the influence of the interest in propagandizing people in the dichotomy that it's grown up between reporting processes. You mentioned in a conversation we had about CNN and Fox being 2 heads of the same beast. And I think we can see, if we examine and want to take the time to examine journalists themselves and what they're reporting on and what their history is, I think we can find links if we want to go there. The thing is, I think part of the root of the problem that we see in getting accurate information is that there's a long history of distortions in the media, and history itself can be very unreliable in certain circumstances, yet we make decisions and beliefs and perspectives based on that as well. I'm more familiar with that than I am the current day as to who might be doing what. But what I did fault the media for is that when things are pointed out, they should be more open and honest about them. I tried to talk to David Remnick at the New Yorker about Lawrence Wright's history. Got no response. They weren't interested. People at HBO, et cetera. When I was examining the Church of Scientology, they didn't respond. The problem, isn't that they decide to respond or not. The problem is that they become immune to the real world with real people in it. And my perspective has always been basically from the common man's look of the world, because that's what I'm familiar with. I'm just another guy down the street. But the media elite has taken control of what we read, what we see, what we decide to entertain ourselves with in the media. I have to, I've done some intensive research into Chicago organized crime. And one of the very interesting things I found is a vast distortion of history in what we believe about organized crime in America, and particularly Chicago's organized crime. And that is that Al Capone was the leader of the Chicago mob and really formed the Chicago mob and made it what it was. That's a myth. Al Capone was a heavy within the Chicago mob for a while, but the man that ran the Chicago mob, that designed its activities, that made it the powerful organization it was, that took it into Las Vegas, that took it into other parts of the country, was a guy named Jacob Guzik. He was a Russian Jew, not an Italian. And the mob was never all Italian in Chicago. or other parts of the country, it was multi-ethnic. But we have we have history teaching us in the media in the form of movies and those sorts of things, teaching us that this is the way that organization was. But I interviewed Jake Duzik's son. I found him. I had a mentor in the Chicago mob who was Tony Accardo, Big Tuna's midnight pinochle partner. He took me through the organization and introduced me to people. And one of the reasons he did that was because he wanted me to write a book saying that Al Capone didn't run the Chicago mob. It was a multi-ethnic organization, and here was the history, and he had the access to the people that could tell me that true history. I have tapes of those interviews and things. I've written that book. I haven't published it yet. But it's just one of the interesting facets of history in the media, from the movies on down, to create impressions as to what is or what isn't. You know, the famous scene in the movie Capone with Robert De Niro in it, where he takes a baseball bat to a couple of guys in a restaurant. Well, you know, that's a fictitious scene, but it's patterned after something else that happened in the hierarchy in the organization. But it was Sam Giancana in a restaurant. He didn't kill an individual, but he beat him in front of others, including the wives of members of the organization, because of betrayal. But he didn't kill him. And that story probably filtered out somewhere along the way and was recreated into something else. Well, that reinforced our idea about the Italians and what we think about the Italian mafia.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been alive for 41 years on this earth, and I've never had a problem with the Italian mob. Call me crazy. I don't think I've ever even seen one.
You have to know where to look.
Yeah, that is true. I guess I'm hanging out in all the wrong spots, I guess.
There you go.
So when it comes to your book, The Manchurian Journalist, what would you like to add? Anything that you want the people to know about your work here and where it's going and where it's been, and some the more important aspects of the intelligence involvement in the CIA? Do you feel like we left anything out? Anything you want to touch on?
I think we've covered a lot of ground very well, but you know, I think it's important for people to realize that there are very honest and independent journalists out there that want to do good work, and the institutional structure that carried forward a lot of good work in journalism has deteriorated. We need to rethink the media and its independence and its truthfulness and its accuracy. I'm not in favor of censorship or oversight boards or those sorts of things. I'm interested in independence, but I do think that what this tells us, what this book shows, and what it documents is that our media circumstances has a long history of being influenced by people we don't see, who we don't know are having the kinds of influence over the media that we have seen. The takeaway, I think, is about journalism itself, and the book really is about journalism. It's about the need to have reliable outlets, to revive some of the traditions of good reporting, to respect the value of journalists who are honest and trying to do good work, and not automatically suspect everyone, nor not automatically assume that everybody's telling us the truth.
Yeah, yeah, I've been fooled before.
Yes, there are.
So I use that as my way to look at things, and I make a decision to not take anyone's word for it and look things up, and that's exactly how I met you. And I do appreciate you taking the time to do this interview with me. I really find your book fascinating. I find your work fascinating, and I do consider you to be a last of a dying breed, because I do see you as an independent, fair, and honest journalist. Depending on what, despite how you may feel of certain things, I believe that your work you go into it with pure intentions for facts, and that's very evident by your writing. So I commend you, sir, and thank you for taking the time to do this interview with me, Dan. It was a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure having a good conversation, and good luck to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. And I'll give you a call as soon as I end this show.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dan Luzadder, and I highly recommend going to trineday.com and picking up a copy of this book. This book and this story of Lawrence Wright, what Dan has put together here is a very good way to take you down a rabbit hole based on facts, to do your own research and the development of our media. We're so quick to say as individuals that we don't believe our media, we don't trust our media. Well, why? Oh, because they're biased, they're not fair. Okay, why? This book will help you understand why and what underlying ominous goals some people may have that are in our media. And for me personally, I am tired of hearing it blamed on the left and on the right. It's neither. It's the same. And we are the pawns in their game. And that is my humble opinion on the situation. But I highly, again, recommend going to trineday.com and picking up a copy of Dan's book, The Manchurian Journalist, and equip yourself with some basic knowledge of the ground of how our intelligence agencies got their tentacles in our journalism, and you will then become aware of what's happening and be able to articulate your points a lot better. Again, I highly recommend this book. And thank you for tuning in to The American Rising. It is always a pleasure. I am your host, Barry Ramey. Make sure you follow our X page at the American Rise, and we are now on TikTok at The American Rise. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
We will get through the uncertainty of a new administration in Washington. As I said, we've done this before. We've been through this. And
isn't necessarily the best place to start. In fact, I think our reverence for the truth might have become a bit of a distraction that is.
You condemn white supremacy. And he fuddled around, didn't say anything. I said, how about the Proud Boys? And he said, well,
Ronald Reagan was 2 months into his presidency when John Hinckley Jr. blew a $29
If you want to really see something that said, take a look what happened.
I want to take this message to talk to your viewers real quick about the story, the conversation